Officer Margaret Sullivan froze mid-step, her radio crackling forgotten in her trembling hand as she watched her German shepherd emerge from beneath the twisted wreckage. Atlas wasn't carrying evidence or debris. Clenched gently in his powerful jaws was an 18-month-old baby girl, her tiny pink dress torn but her chest rising and falling with precious breath. This wasn't protocol. This was impossible. Deputy Morrison's coffee cup shattered against the asphalt as he stumbled backward, his face draining of color. Paramedics stopped their frantic work on the crash victims, their equipment abandoned as every eye fixed on the massive dog now bolting toward the dense East Texas pine forest with his impossible cargo. Margaret's heart hammered against her ribs. 30 years on the force, and she'd never seen Atlas disobey a direct command. She could still hear Miguel Rodriguez screaming from the overturned minivan, "Isabella! Where's my baby Isabella? All units, pursue immediately!" She barked into her radio, her voice cracking with disbelief and terror. What was Atlas doing? And why was he running away from help instead of toward it? Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. 6 months earlier, Margaret Sullivan had been living on borrowed time in more ways than one. At 58, with 18 months left before mandatory retirement, she'd thought her biggest worry was figuring out what to do with her pension and her empty farmhouse on the outskirts of Millfield, Texas. Then Dr. Sarah Mitchell had called her into that sterile office and changed everything with 3 words: Stage 3, cancer. The lung cancer diagnosis hit harder than any criminal she'd ever faced. 30 years of breathing in exhaust fumes, cigarette smoke from crime scenes, and the dust of countless investigations had finally caught up with her. But Margaret wasn't ready to give up her badge. Not when it meant losing her health insurance, and certainly not when it meant abandoning Atlas. Atlas had been her partner for 3 years, ever since the German shepherd's spectacular failure during the Tommy Rodriguez search. The 6-year-old boy had vanished during a family camping trip in the Davy Crockett National Forest, and Atlas, then part of the county's search and rescue team, had been brought in to find him. For 72 agonizing hours, the dog had led searchers in circles, his nose apparently failing him when it mattered most. Tommy's body was never found, and Atlas was quietly retired from active duty, destined for euthanasia until Margaret intervened. Nobody else wanted a broken dog, she'd told her late husband Frank's photograph that night, scratching Atlas behind his graying ears. Guess that makes us a perfect match. The farmhouse where they lived together had once echoed with Frank's laughter and the dreams they'd shared of filling it with grandchildren. Now it held only the soft padding of Atlas's paws on hardwood floors and the gentle hum of Margaret's oxygen concentrator, which she used secretly during her worst breathing episodes. She'd become expert at hiding her condition, scheduling her chemotherapy sessions on her days off, explaining her fatigue as getting old, and keeping her inhaler hidden in her patrol car's glove compartment. Atlas seemed to understand her secrets without judgment. The 70-pound German shepherd had developed an uncanny ability to sense when her breathing became labored, positioning himself close enough for her to steady herself against his solid frame. During her darkest moments, when the cancer felt like a death sentence and retirement felt like abandonment, Atlas would rest his massive head on her lap, his amber eyes reflecting a wisdom that transcended his past failures. "The good Lord works in mysterious ways," Margaret would whisper into his fur, repeating the phrase her grandmother had taught her decades ago. She'd learned to find comfort in the routine of their partnership. Morning patrols through Millfield's quiet streets, afternoon paperwork at the station, and evening walks around the property where Frank's ghost still seemed to linger in every sunset. Neither Margaret nor Atlas knew that their most important mission still lay ahead, waiting in the twisted metal and broken glass of Highway 287, where a baby's cry would awaken something profound in both their damaged hearts. The call came through Margaret's radio at exactly 3:30 p.m. on a sweltering Tuesday afternoon, cutting through the lazy hum of cicadas and the distant rumble of 18-wheelers on Highway 287. Unit 47, we have a multi-vehicle collision with injuries, mile marker 23, eastbound lanes, EMS en route. Margaret felt her chest tighten, not from the cancer this time, but from the urgency in dispatcher Jenny Walsh's voice. In 30 years of law enforcement, she'd learned to read the subtle variations in tone that separated fender benders from tragedies. This was the latter. "Copy that, dispatch. Unit 47 responding." She hit the sirens and felt Atlas shift in the back seat, his ears perking up as the familiar adrenaline of an emergency call washed over them both. The German Shepherd had ridden shotgun on hundreds of calls, but today something felt different. His amber eyes held an intensity Margaret had never seen before, as if he could already smell the disaster waiting for them down the highway. The scene that greeted them was worse than Margaret's darkest expectations. A white Honda minivan lay crumpled and overturned in the east ditch, its roof compressed nearly to the window line. Steam rose from the twisted metal like incense from a funeral pyre. 50 yards away, a blue pickup truck sat wrapped around the thick trunk of an ancient oak tree, its front end accordioned into unrecognizable scrap. Paramedics Jake Morrison and Lisa Chen were already working frantically over 2 victims near the ambulance. Margaret could see a woman's dark hair spilling from beneath an oxygen mask, her olive skin pale with shock and blood loss. A man sat upright on a backboard, conscious but restrained, his desperate eyes scanning the crash scene with wild panic. "Miguel! Miguel! Where's Isabella?" The woman's voice cut through the chaos like a knife, weak but piercing with maternal terror. "Our baby! Where's our baby?" Margaret's radio crackled with Deputy Morrison's voice. "We have 2 critical injuries from the minivan. Elena Rodriguez, 32, severe internal trauma, and Miguel Rodriguez, 35, possible spinal injuries." Driver of the pickup truck fled the scene before first responders arrived. As Margaret approached the overturned Honda, Atlas began behaving in ways that defied his 3 years of disciplined training. The dog's entire body went rigid, his nose working overtime as he caught scents that seemed to agitate him beyond measure. Instead of staying at Margaret's side as protocol demanded, Atlas broke away and began circling the wreckage with increasing urgency. "Atlas, heel!" Margaret commanded, but her partner ignored her completely, something that had never happened in their entire partnership. The German Shepherd dropped to his belly and began army crawling beneath the overturned vehicle, his powerful shoulders disappearing into the dark space between twisted metal and scorched earth. Margaret's heart hammered against her ribs. The vehicle wasn't stable. Any sudden shift could crush whatever, or whoever, Atlas was pursuing underneath. "Atlas, no! Get out of there!" But Atlas had found what he was looking for. When the German Shepherd emerged from beneath the wreckage 30 seconds later, Margaret's world tilted on its axis. Clenched gently but firmly in Atlas's massive jaws was a tiny bundle wrapped in a yellow blanket. An 18-month-old baby girl with dark curls peeking out from under a pink knit cap. The child's face was pale but unmarked, her chest rising and falling with the precious rhythm of life. Miguel Rodriguez's anguished cry split the afternoon air. "Isabella! My Isabella!" For one crystalline moment, Margaret thought Atlas would bring the baby directly to the paramedics, as any properly trained rescue dog should. Instead, her partner made a decision that would haunt and mystify everyone present for years to come. Atlas turned away from the ambulance, away from the reaching arms of medical professionals, away from the desperate pleas of the baby's parents. With Isabella secure in his gentle grip, the German Shepherd bolted toward the tree line where East Texas pine forest stretched endlessly into shadow and mystery. "Atlas!" Margaret's voice cracked with panic and disbelief as she watched her partner disappear into the dense woods. "Stop!" But Atlas was already gone, swallowed by the green darkness of the Davy Crockett National Forest, carrying the most precious cargo of his life away from safety and into the unknown. Miguel Rodriguez's screams echoed across the crash site. "Bring back my baby! Somebody bring back my baby!" Margaret's radio exploded with chatter as she stumbled toward the forest, her breathing already labored from the stress and exertion. Behind her, she could hear Jake Morrison shouting into his radio, "All units, we have a canine gone rogue with an infant. Repeat, pursuing German Shepherd with baby into the woods off Highway 287. We need search teams immediately." As Margaret plunged into the forest after Atlas, one question burned in her mind above all others. Why had her faithful, disciplined partner just committed what looked like the most heinous act of his career? The East Texas pine forest seemed to swallow sound itself as Margaret crashed through the underbrush, her service weapon bouncing against her hip with each desperate step. Branches tore at her uniform and Spanish moss draped across her face like funeral shrouds, but she pressed forward, following the distant sound of Atlas's movement through the dense vegetation. Her lungs burned with each labored breath, the cancer and 30 years of smoking exacting their cruel toll when she needed her strength most. Every few yards, she had to stop and lean against a tree trunk, fighting the urge to collapse as her chest seized with pain. The irony wasn't lost on her. She was literally chasing her dying breath through a forest that felt more like a maze with each passing minute. "Atlas!" she called out, her voice hoarse and desperate. "Bring her back, boy. Bring Isabella back!" Behind her, she could hear the thunderous approach of the search team. Deputy Morrison's heavy boots, Jake the paramedic's medical bag clattering against branches, and the distant baying of bloodhounds from the county K9 unit. But Atlas had a significant head start, and Margaret knew these woods better than anyone. If her partner wanted to disappear, he could stay hidden for days. After what felt like an eternity but was probably only 15 minutes, Margaret finally spotted them. In a small clearing roughly 300 yards from the crash site, Atlas had stopped running. The massive German Shepherd sat perfectly still in the center of the open space, baby Isabella cradled carefully between his front paws like the most precious treasure in creation. The sight that greeted Margaret nearly brought her to her knees. Atlas had positioned himself over the baby with the protective instincts of a mother wolf guarding her pup. His amber eyes swept the perimeter of the clearing constantly, alert for any threat, while his warm breath created small puffs of vapor in the cooling afternoon air as he gently cleaned Isabella's face with his tongue. The baby, miraculously, was not only alive but seemed completely calm in the dog's protective embrace, her tiny hand occasionally reaching up to touch Atlas's muzzle. But it was the location that stopped Margaret's heart cold. She recognized this clearing. Every law enforcement officer in East Texas knew this place, though they weren't supposed to talk about it. This was where Tommy Rodriguez's body had been found 3 years ago, not by Atlas during the official search, but by hunters 2 weeks after the family had given up hope and returned home to grieve. Margaret's radio crackled with static as Jake Morrison's voice broke through. "We've got eyes on the dog and the baby, 300 yards northeast of the crash site, in a clearing. The child appears to be alive and unharmed. Do not approach," Margaret commanded into her radio, her voice carrying an authority that surprised even her. "Atlas is in protection mode. Any sudden movements could spook him." As if responding to her words, Atlas lifted his massive head and looked directly at Margaret. In those intelligent amber eyes, she saw something that made her blood run cold: recognition, purpose, and what looked almost like guilt. The dog whined softly, a sound so heartbreaking that Margaret felt tears she hadn't shed since Frank's funeral start to well up in her eyes. "What are you trying to tell me, boy?" she whispered. slowly approaching with her hands visible and her weapon holstered. "Why did you bring her here?" Atlas shifted slightly, never taking his protective position away from Isabella, but allowing Margaret to see something she had missed in her initial panic. Carved into the bark of the massive oak tree that dominated the clearing was a small memorial, Tommy Rodriguez, age 6, never forgotten, along with a crude cross made from 2 sticks bound with fishing line. The pieces of a horrifying puzzle began clicking into place in Margaret's mind. This wasn't random. Atlas hadn't simply panicked and run into the woods with Isabella. He had brought her to this specific place for a specific reason. The same place where he had failed to save another child 3 years ago. Jake Morrison arrived at the edge of the clearing, his medical bag at the ready, but Margaret held up a hand to stop him. "He's protecting her from something," she said quietly. "Atlas doesn't do anything without a reason." As if summoned by her words, her radio erupted with urgent chatter from the crash site. "Unit 47, we have a problem. Derek Williams, the driver of the pickup truck, has returned to the hospital. He's asking about survivors from the minivan. Specifically, he wants to know if there were any children in the vehicle." Margaret's blood turned to ice water. Why would he care about survivors if it was just an accident? "That's what we're wondering," came Deputy Morrison's voice through the static. "We're running his background now, but something doesn't feel right. He keeps asking about loose ends and finishing what he started." Atlas's protective growl rumbled through the clearing like distant thunder, and Margaret suddenly understood with crystal clarity why her partner had brought Isabella to this sacred place. Atlas hadn't failed Tommy Rodriguez. He had found the boy, but too late to save him. And now, with his extraordinary senses, Atlas had detected something at the crash site that no human could perceive. The scent of premeditation, of calculated violence, of a predator who wasn't finished hunting. Derek Williams wasn't coming back to check on his victims out of remorse. He was coming back to eliminate witnesses. And somehow Atlas had known. Margaret's hands trembled as she keyed her radio, her eyes never leaving Atlas and baby Isabella in their protective tableau beneath the old oak tree. "Dispatch, I need everything you can find on Derek Williams. Criminal history, mental health records, family status, and I need it now." The response came back within minutes, crackling through the static with information that made Margaret's stomach clench with dread. "Unit 47, Derek Williams, age 52, unemployed mechanic from Beaumont. Lost his 8-year-old daughter, Sarah Williams, in a drunk driving accident 2 years ago. Multiple arrests for public intoxication, disorderly conduct, and making threats against random families. Last known address is a trailer park on the outskirts of town." Jake Morrison approached the edge of the clearing cautiously, his medical bag ready but his movements deliberately slow and non-threatening. "Margaret, that baby needs medical attention. Her core temperature is dropping, and we don't know what internal injuries she might have from the crash." Atlas's amber eyes tracked Jake's movement, but the German Shepherd remained in his protective crouch over Isabella, his massive body creating a living shield around the child. Every few seconds, Atlas would lift his head and scan the forest perimeter, as if expecting danger to emerge from the shadows at any moment. "He's not going to let us near her," Margaret realized aloud, her breathing becoming more labored as the stress aggravated her condition. "Atlas thinks someone's coming for her, and he's not wrong." Her radio crackled again with an update that confirmed her worst fears. "All units, Derek Williams has left Millfield General Hospital against medical advice. Last seen driving a borrowed pickup truck, heading east on Highway 287. Consider him armed and extremely dangerous." Margaret felt her chest tighten, but this time it wasn't the cancer. It was pure, cold terror. Derek Williams was heading back to the crash site, and given his history of targeting families with young children, his intentions were horrifyingly clear. He wasn't returning to check on his victims, he was coming back to finish what he'd started. "Jake, radio for backup," Margaret commanded, checking her service weapon and spare ammunition. "I want every available unit between here and the highway, and get Elena and Miguel Rodriguez to safety. If Derek is targeting their family specifically, the hospital isn't secure enough." As if responding to the urgency in Margaret's voice, Atlas let out a low, rumbling growl that seemed to vibrate through the forest floor. The dog's hackles rose along his spine, transforming his already impressive frame into something genuinely intimidating. Isabella, seemingly oblivious to the danger surrounding her, continued to reach up with tiny fingers to touch Atlas's muzzle, her soft babbling providing an innocent counterpoint to the mounting tension. Margaret's radio burst with static as Deputy Morrison's voice cut through. "Margaret, we've got a situation at the hospital." Derek Williams was there asking detailed questions about the Rodriguez family. How many children they had, what their names were, where they lived. The nursing staff said he seemed specifically interested in whether there were any survivors who could identify him. The pieces of Derek's twisted plan became horrifyingly clear. This hadn't been a random drunk driving accident. It had been a calculated attack on a family that reminded him of everything he'd lost. And now, with potential witnesses still alive, Derek was returning to eliminate any evidence that could link him to premeditated murder. "He researched them," Margaret whispered into her radio, the full scope of Derek's evil becoming apparent. The Rodriguez family wasn't random. He chose them specifically because they have children the same age as his daughter was. Atlas's protective instincts seemed to intensify with each passing minute. The German Shepherd had positioned himself so that his body formed a complete barrier between Isabella and any potential approach route through the forest. His training as a former search and rescue dog merged seamlessly with his natural protective instincts, creating a living fortress around the vulnerable child. Margaret tried to approach closer, but Atlas issued a warning growl that stopped her in her tracks. The dog's message was clear. No one, not even his beloved partner, was getting near Isabella until the threat was neutralized. It was both heartbreaking and awe-inspiring to witness such unwavering dedication to protecting an innocent life. "Talk to me, boy," Margaret said softly, crouching down to Atlas's eye level but maintaining a respectful distance. "You know something we don't you?" "You can smell his intentions, can't you?" German Shepherds possessed olfactory capabilities 40 times more sensitive than humans, Margaret knew. Atlas could detect the chemical signatures of fear, aggression, and deception in ways that no human could comprehend. At the crash site, while everyone else had been focused on the obvious injuries and damage, Atlas had been processing information that told a completely different story. The scent of alcohol mixed with premeditation, the chemical markers of someone who had been planning violence rather than simply making a tragic mistake. Jake Morrison's radio crackled with an urgent update from the crash site. "We've got tire tracks leading from the highway into the forest access road. Fresh tracks from a pickup truck, and they're heading in your direction." Margaret's blood turned to ice. Derek Williams wasn't just coming back to the scene, he was actively hunting them down. The access road Jake mentioned was an old logging trail that came within 100 yards of their current location. Derek could be on top of them within minutes. "Jake, how long until backup arrives?" Margaret asked, checking her weapon again and mentally calculating sight lines and potential cover positions in the clearing. "At least 15 minutes for the nearest units," came the reply. "Sheriff's Department is mobilizing, but you're pretty isolated out there." 15 minutes felt like an eternity when facing an armed man with nothing left to lose. Margaret looked at Atlas, still maintaining his protective vigil over Isabella, and made a decision that went against every protocol in her 30-year career. "I'm staying with them," she announced into her radio. "Atlas knows something we don't, and I'm not leaving this baby unprotected." Her decision was met with immediate protests from Jake and the other responding officers, but Margaret's mind was made up. Atlas had saved Tommy Rodriguez 3 years ago, too late to prevent the boy's death, but he had found him when no one else could. Now, faced with another child in mortal danger, the German Shepherd was determined not to fail again. As if sensing Margaret's resolve, Atlas shifted slightly, allowing her to move closer to his protective circle. The dog's amber eyes met hers with an intensity that seemed almost human, and Margaret felt an unspoken understanding pass between them. They were partners in the truest sense, two damaged souls who had found purpose in protecting others, even when it meant putting their own lives at risk. Isabella's soft breathing created small puffs of vapor in the cooling afternoon air, a reminder of how precious and fragile the life they were protecting truly was. The baby's dark curls framed a face that bore a striking resemblance to Tommy Rodriguez, and Margaret wondered if that similarity was part of what had triggered Atlas's protective response. The sound of a truck engine echoing through the forest made Margaret's heart race. Derek Williams was close, very close, and the final confrontation was about to begin. Margaret checked her radio one last time, ensuring that backup was still en route, then focused all her attention on the forest perimeter. Atlas's growl deepened, becoming a sound that seemed to emanate from the very earth itself. The German Shepherd had detected something that Margaret's human senses couldn't yet perceive, the approach of a predator who had come to finish what he'd started. "Stay strong, boy," Margaret whispered to her partner. "We're not letting him hurt this baby. Not today, not ever." In the distance, the sound of footsteps crashing through underbrush grew louder, accompanied by the occasional curse and the metallic scrape of something heavy being dragged through the forest. Derek Williams was coming, and he was armed. The first glimpse of Derek Williams through the pine trees made Margaret's blood run cold. The man who emerged from the forest shadows bore little resemblance to the unconscious drunk driver she'd expected to find. Derek moved with calculated purpose, a hunting rifle cradled in his arms like a soldier advancing on enemy territory. His clothes were torn from pushing through the underbrush, but his eyes held a clarity that spoke of deadly intent rather than alcohol-fueled confusion. "I know you're out there," Derek's voice echoed through the clearing, rough with rage and something darker. "I can hear that damn dog growling. You think you can hide from me? You think you can protect them?" Atlas's response was immediate and terrifying. The German Shepherd rose to his full height over Isabella, his 85 pounds of muscle and bone transforming into a living weapon. His hackles stood like a mohawk down his spine, and the growl that rumbled from his chest was unlike anything Margaret had heard in their 3 years together, primal, warning, and absolutely uncompromising. Margaret drew her service weapon, her hands steadier than they had any right to be given the circumstances. 30 years of training took over, even as her lungs burned with each breath and her heart hammered against her ribs. She positioned herself behind the thick trunk of an oak tree, creating a triangle of protection with Atlas and the baby at its center. "Derek Williams, this is Officer Sullivan with the Millfield Police Department," she called out, her voice carrying the authority of 3 decades in law enforcement. "Put down your weapon and step into the clearing where I can see you." Derek's laugh was a harsh sound that seemed to scrape against the forest itself. "Officer Sullivan? I know who you are. Dying cop with a broken dog, thinking you can play hero one last time. Well, here's a news flash. Heroes die, just like everyone else." The casual reference to her cancer diagnosis sent a chill down Margaret's spine. Derek had done his homework, researching not just the Rodriguez family, but anyone who might stand in his way. This level of premeditation transformed what might have been a tragic accident into something far more sinister. "What do you want, Derek?" Margaret kept her weapon trained on the tree line while trying to spot his exact position. "The Rodriguez family never did anything to you. Isabella is just a baby. What do I want? Derek's voice cracked with pain and fury. I want my Sarah back. I want my little girl who will never see another birthday because some drunk bastard thought his convenience was more important than her life. But since I can't have that, I'll settle for making sure another drunk doesn't get to keep what was stolen from me. Margaret's confusion must have shown in her voice. Derek, you were the drunk driver. You hit their car. No! Derek's scream echoed through the forest like a wounded animal. I wasn't drunk, I was hunting. I've been planning this for months, watching families, waiting for the right moment. The Rodriguez family gets to feel what I felt when I lost everything. They get to know what it's like when happy families are torn apart by someone else's choices. The twisted logic of Derek's revenge became horrifyingly clear. In his mind, he wasn't the perpetrator. He was the instrument of justice, visiting upon other families the same devastation that had been visited upon his. The fact that he was sober during the attack made it infinitely more chilling than any drunk driving accident. Atlas seemed to sense the escalating danger. The dog's protective positioning over Isabella became even more pronounced, his body lowering into a crouch that would allow him to either shield the baby from gunfire or launch himself at an attacker in a heartbeat. His amber eyes never left the forest perimeter, tracking movements that Margaret's human senses couldn't detect. She's not even 2 years old, Derek. Margaret tried appealing to whatever humanity might remain in the man. Isabella has never hurt anyone. She's innocent. So was Sarah. Derek's voice broke with grief before hardening again. So was my little girl when that drunk son of a bitch plowed into our car. Do you think innocence mattered then? Do you think the universe cared that she was only 8 years old? Margaret could hear the sound of Derek moving through the underbrush, circling the clearing like a predator seeking the best angle of attack. Her radio remained silent. Backup was still minutes away, and she was running out of time to de-escalate the situation peacefully. Derek, listen to me. Margaret tried a different approach, drawing on her years of crisis negotiation training. What happened to Sarah was a tragedy, but killing Isabella won't bring your daughter back. It will only create more families torn apart by grief. Good, Derek snarled from somewhere behind a cluster of pine trees. Let them all feel what I feel. Let them all know what it's like to have their world destroyed by someone else's selfishness. The first shot came without warning, a sharp crack that sent bark exploding from the tree trunk just inches from Margaret's head. Atlas's response was instantaneous. The German Shepherd flattened himself completely over Isabella, his body becoming a living shield as the baby's startled cry pierced the afternoon air. Margaret returned fire immediately, aiming for the muzzle flash she'd spotted among the trees. Derek, stop! There's no need for this to end in bloodshed. But Derek was beyond reason. The second shot shattered a branch just above Atlas and Isabella, raining debris down on the protective dog and the child he was guarding. Atlas didn't flinch, didn't move, didn't give even an inch of ground that might expose Isabella to harm. That dog of yours is impressive, Derek called out, his voice now coming from a different position. But even he can't stop bullets forever. All I need is one clear shot. Margaret's mind raced through tactical options. The clearing provided minimal cover. Derek had the advantage of mobility while she was pinned protecting Atlas and Isabella, and her backup was still too far away to matter. Worse, her breathing was becoming increasingly labored as the stress and exertion triggered her cancer symptoms. The third shot came closer, so close that Margaret felt the wind from the bullet as it passed her ear. Derek was methodically zeroing in on their position, and she was running out of trees to hide behind. Atlas, we need to move, she whispered to her partner. But the German Shepherd's response was a barely audible whine that somehow conveyed his complete refusal to abandon his protective position over Isabella. In that moment, Margaret understood something profound about her partner. Atlas wasn't just protecting Isabella because of his training or even his natural protective instincts. He was protecting her because he had failed Tommy Rodriguez 3 years ago, and that failure had haunted him every day since. This baby represented his chance for redemption, his opportunity to prove that sometimes, just sometimes, the good guys could save the innocent. Derek's voice cut through the forest again, closer now, more confident. "I've got all day, Officer Sullivan." "How long do you think you can keep this up? How long before that cancer in your lungs makes it impossible to hold that gun steady?" Margaret's radio finally crackled with the sound she'd been praying for. "Unit 47, this is backup. We have multiple units converging on your location. ETA 3 minutes. But 3 minutes might as well have been 3 hours. Derek had closed the distance significantly, and Margaret could see his shadow moving between the trees, getting closer to a position where he'd have a clear shot at Atlas and Isabella. 3 minutes too late, Derek laughed, having heard the radio transmission. "I only need 30 seconds. The fourth shot was the closest yet, so close that it kicked up dirt just inches from Isabella's pink blanket. Atlas's growl deepened to a sound that seemed to come from the very depths of his soul, not just anger, but absolute determination. This dog would die before he let harm come to the child under his protection. Margaret made a decision that went against every tactical protocol she'd ever learned. Instead of staying behind cover, she stepped into the open, drawing Derek's attention away from Atlas and Isabella and onto herself. "Here I am, Derek," she shouted, her weapon trained on the trees where she'd last seen movement. "You want to finish this? Then finish it with me, not with an innocent baby." Derek's final position became clear as he stepped out from behind a massive pine tree, his rifle aimed directly at Margaret's chest. At this distance, there would be no missing, no second chances, no miraculous interventions. "Finally," Derek said, his finger moving to the trigger. "Someone willing to face the consequences of their choices." The gunshot that shattered the forest silence didn't come from Derek Williams' rifle. Atlas had made his choice in the split second before Derek's finger could complete its deadly journey to the trigger. 85 pounds of German Shepherd muscle launched through the air like a living missile, his powerful jaws clamping down on Derek's gun arm just as the rifle discharged harmlessly into the canopy above. The impact sent both man and dog crashing to the forest floor in a tangle of fur, fabric, and fury. Derek's screams echoed through the trees as Atlas maintained his grip, his training and protective instincts merging into something primal and absolute. The rifle spun away into the underbrush, its threat neutralized by a dog who had chosen to break every rule of his training to save the lives of those he loved. Margaret's own weapon barked twice in quick succession, both shots finding their mark in Derek's legs, ensuring he wouldn't be getting up to continue his rampage even after Atlas released him. The man's agonized cries mixed with the distant sound of sirens as backup finally arrived at the highway access point. "Atlas, release!" Margaret commanded, her voice hoarse with emotion and exertion. The German Shepherd immediately obeyed, stepping back from Derek but positioning himself between the wounded man and baby Isabella, who had remained miraculously calm throughout the entire ordeal. Derek writhed on the forest floor, clutching his wounded arm and legs, his face twisted with pain and rage that even gunshot wounds couldn't diminish. "You don't understand," he gasped between labored breaths. "She has to pay. They all have to pay. My Sarah. My little girl." Margaret approached cautiously, her weapon still trained on Derek even though he clearly posed no further threat. Blood seeped through his fingers where Atlas's teeth had found their mark, and the leg wounds from her shots were bleeding steadily but not life-threateningly. "It's over, Derek," Margaret said quietly, her own breath coming in ragged gasps as the adrenaline began to fade and her cancer symptoms reasserted themselves with a vengeance. "No one else has to die today." But Derek's eyes held a light that spoke of madness rather than reason. You think this ends it? You think stopping me changes anything? There are others out there, other families living happy lives while my Sarah rots in the ground. This was just the beginning. The sound of approaching boots crashed through the underbrush as Deputy Morrison and the backup units finally reached the clearing. Margaret had never been so grateful to see reinforcements in her 30-year career, even as her legs trembled with exhaustion and her lungs burned with each breath. "Jesus Christ, Margaret," Jake Morrison breathed as he took in the scene. Derek bleeding on the ground, Atlas standing guard over Isabella, and Margaret swaying on her feet like a tree about to fall. "Are you hit? Is the baby okay?" We're fine," Margaret managed, though the words came out between gasps. "But Derek needs medical attention. Atlas did a number on his arm, and I put 2 in his legs." As the paramedics worked to stabilize Derek's wounds, Margaret finally allowed herself to approach Atlas and Isabella. The baby had somehow slept through most of the gunfight, her tiny chest rising and falling peacefully as Atlas maintained his protective vigil. The sight of such innocence preserved in the midst of such violence nearly brought Margaret to her knees. "Good boy," she whispered to Atlas, her voice breaking with emotion. "Such a good boy. You saved her, didn't you?" "You saved them both." Atlas looked up at her with those intelligent amber eyes, and Margaret could swear she saw something like relief in their depths. The guilt and shame that had haunted him since Tommy Rodriguez's death seemed to lift slightly, replaced by the satisfaction of a job finally done right. But Margaret's moment of triumph was short-lived. As the adrenaline faded, the cancer symptoms that she'd been suppressing through sheer force of will came roaring back with a vengeance. Her chest tightened until each breath felt like breathing through a straw, and the familiar taste of copper filled her mouth. "Margaret?" Jake Morrison was suddenly at her side, his trained medic's eyes taking in her pale complexion and labored breathing. "You need to sit down. Now." "I'm fine," Margaret lied, even as her legs finally gave out and she sank to the forest floor beside Atlas and Isabella. Just need a minute to catch my breath." But Jake wasn't buying it. Years of emergency medical training had taught him to recognize the signs of serious respiratory distress, and Margaret was displaying all of them. "When was the last time you took your medication? And don't lie to me, I've seen enough cancer patients to know the symptoms." Margaret's carefully constructed facade finally crumbled under the weight of exhaustion and emotion. 8 months, she whispered, the words barely audible. "Diagnosed 8 months ago. Stage 3. I've been hiding it because if they knew, they'd make me retire, and Atlas would—" She couldn't finish the sentence, but Jake understood. A retired police dog with Atlas's history would likely be euthanized rather than rehomed, especially after today's incident would undoubtedly be labeled as aggressive behavior by someone who didn't understand the full context. The irony was devastating. In saving Isabella's life, Atlas may have sealed his own fate. Police departments didn't keep dogs who attacked suspects, even when those attacks were justified. The bureaucracy would see a canine who had disobeyed direct orders and used excessive force, not a hero who had prevented a child's murder. As the paramedics loaded Derek Williams onto a stretcher for transport to the hospital, his final words to Margaret carried the weight of prophecy. "You think you've won something here? That dog will be put down within a week for what he did to me. And that baby? She'll grow up knowing that her parents' accident was really murder. Some victory, Officer Sullivan." Margaret clutched Atlas closer, her heart breaking at the realization that their greatest triumph might also be their final tragedy. The veterinary emergency room at East Texas Animal Hospital buzzed with tense energy as Dr. Rachel Chen worked frantically to save Atlas's life. The German Shepherd lay unconscious on the steel operating table, his powerful frame reduced to stillness by anesthesia and blood loss. Derek Williams' rifle shot had found its mark during the struggle, the bullet tearing through Atlas's shoulder and nicking a major artery. "We're losing him," Dr. Chen announced to her surgical team, her voice tight with concentration as monitors showed Atlas's vital signs dropping into dangerous territory. Blood pressure is crashing, and his heart rate is becoming erratic. In the waiting room, Margaret sat hunched over in a plastic chair, an oxygen tank beside her, and a clear tube running under her nose. The confrontation in the forest had triggered the worst cancer episode she'd experienced since her diagnosis, and Jake Morrison had insisted on emergency treatment before she could even think about leaving the hospital. "Any word?" Deputy Morrison asked as he entered the waiting room, his uniform still stained with forest debris and Derek Williams' blood. The sight of the usually unflappable officer looking so shaken spoke volumes about how close they'd all come to tragedy. Margaret shook her head, her eyes never leaving the surgical suite doors. Dr. Chen said it would be touch and go. The bullet hit an artery, and he lost a lot of blood before they could get him into surgery. What Margaret couldn't bring herself to voice was the crushing irony of the situation. Even if Atlas survived his physical wounds, the bureaucratic machinery was already grinding into motion to destroy him. Chief Bradley had called twice, demanding a full report on the K9 incident, and making it clear that Atlas's aggressive behavior toward a suspect, regardless of the circumstances, would result in immediate termination of his service and likely euthanization. Jake Morrison settled into the chair beside Margaret, his young face etched with exhaustion and something deeper, a moral confusion that came from witnessing heroism being punished by the very system it had served. "Margaret, about what the chief said regarding Atlas." "I know," Margaret cut him off, her voice hollow. "I heard the radio chatter. They're going to put him down for being a dangerous animal. Never mind that he saved a baby's life. Never mind that Derek Williams was planning to execute an 18-month-old child. All they see is a dog who attacked a suspect." The bitter irony wasn't lost on either of them. Derek Williams would receive the finest medical care the state could provide, would be afforded legal representation and due process, and would likely serve his sentence in relative comfort. Atlas, who had risked everything to protect an innocent life, faced a death sentence for his heroism. Margaret's phone buzzed with a text message that made her blood run cold. "Officer Sullivan, please report to Chief Bradley's office first thing tomorrow morning to discuss the Atlas situation. Bring all relevant paperwork. Chief Bradley." The euphemism, Atlas situation, couldn't disguise what everyone knew was coming. Tomorrow morning, Margaret would be ordered to surrender her partner for euthanization, and there wasn't a damn thing she could do about it legally. "There has to be something we can do," Jake said, reading the distress in Margaret's expression. "Atlas is a hero. The community needs to know what really happened out there." But Margaret had been in law enforcement long enough to understand how these things worked. The official report would focus on the facts that fit the narrative the department needed. A K9 officer had disobeyed direct commands and attacked a suspect, resulting in significant injuries. The context, that the suspect was attempting to murder a baby, would be buried in bureaucratic language and procedural justifications. Dr. Chen emerged from the surgical suite, her scrubs stained with blood and her face unreadable. Margaret's heart stopped as she waited for the verdict that would determine whether her partner would live to face his execution or die a hero's death on the operating table. "He's stable," Dr. Chen announced, and Margaret felt tears of relief stream down her face. "The surgery was successful. We were able to repair the arterial damage and remove the bullet fragments. Atlas is strong, and his will to live is remarkable. He should make a full recovery." The words should have brought Margaret nothing but joy, but instead they carried the weight of tragedy. Atlas would recover just in time to be put down for his act of heroism. "Can I see him?" Margaret asked, her voice barely a whisper. Dr. Chen nodded. "He's still unconscious, but you can sit with him. Sometimes familiar voices help with recovery." The recovery room was quiet except for the soft beeping of monitors and the gentle whoosh of Atlas's breathing. Margaret sat beside the unconscious German shepherd, her hand resting gently on his uninjured flank, feeling the steady rise and fall of his chest that proved life still flowed through his powerful frame. "I'm so sorry, boy," she whispered, her voice breaking with emotion. "You did everything right, and I couldn't protect you from the system. You saved that baby, and tomorrow they're going to kill you for it." As if responding to her voice, Atlas's eyes fluttered open, amber and unfocused but unmistakably aware. His tail gave the weakest of wags when he saw Margaret, and he tried to lift his head before the pain and medication forced him back down. "Easy, boy," Margaret soothed, gently stroking his head. "Just rest. Everything's going to be—" But she couldn't finish the lie. Everything wasn't going to be all right. In 12 hours, she would be ordered to bring Atlas to be euthanized, and there wasn't enough justice in the world to prevent it. Margaret's phone rang, and she was surprised to see Elena Rodriguez's name on the caller ID. The woman should still be in intensive care, recovering from her own injuries sustained in Derek's attack. "Mrs. Rodriguez?" Margaret answered, confused. Elena's voice was weak but determined. "Officer Sullivan, I heard about Atlas, about what they're planning to do to him." "I can't. I won't let them kill the dog who saved my daughter's life." "I appreciate the sentiment, but there's nothing you can do," Margaret replied sadly. "The department has procedures and Atlas attacked a suspect. The circumstances don't matter to them." "Maybe they don't matter to the department," Elena said, her voice growing stronger. "But they matter to the people of this community. And sometimes, Officer Sullivan, the people have more power than the bureaucrats realize." Something in Elena's tone made Margaret sit up straighter. "What are you thinking?" "I'm thinking," Elena replied, "that it's time for the whole truth to come out. And I'm thinking that a community that learns how a hero dog saved a baby's life might have something to say about that hero being executed for his trouble." For the first time since the shooting, Margaret felt a tiny spark of hope flicker in her chest. Maybe Atlas's story didn't have to end in a sterile vet's office with a lethal injection. Maybe, just maybe, there was another way. Elena Rodriguez's phone call set in motion a chain of events that would transform a bureaucratic death sentence into something approaching a miracle. Within hours of their conversation, Margaret found herself at the center of a grassroots campaign that seemed to materialize from the very heart of East Texas itself. It started with Elena's Facebook post from her hospital bed, written in both English and Spanish, accompanied by a photo of baby Isabella sleeping peacefully in her crib. The post went viral within hours, shared thousands of times across social media platforms as the story of Atlas's heroism spread far beyond the borders of Millfield. "This is my daughter Isabella," Elena had written. 3 days ago, a madman tried to murder her to make himself feel better about his own losses. The only thing that stood between my baby and a killer's bullet was a German shepherd named Atlas, who risked his own life to protect an innocent child. Now the same system that Atlas served wants to kill him for being a hero. I won't let that happen. Will you help me save the dog who saved my daughter?" Margaret's phone hadn't stopped ringing since the post went live. Local news stations, national networks, animal rights organizations, and ordinary citizens from across the country were demanding to know how a police department could even consider euthanizing a dog who had prevented a child's murder. The pressure reached a crescendo when Margaret arrived at Chief Bradley's office the next morning, her letter of resignation already written and sealed in an envelope. She'd made her decision during the sleepless night at Atlas's bedside. If the department was determined to kill her partner, they could do it without her badge and her participation. "Officer Sullivan," Chief Bradley began, his weathered face showing the strain of 12 hours of nonstop phone calls from reporters, politicians, and angry citizens. "We need to discuss the Atlas situation." "Yes, sir, we do," Margaret replied, placing her resignation letter on his desk. "And we can start with this. If you're going to murder that dog for saving a baby's life, you'll do it without my badge." Chief Bradley stared at the envelope for a long moment before looking up at Margaret with something she'd never seen in his eyes before: uncertainty. "Sit down, Margaret. There have been some developments." What followed was a conversation that neither of them could have anticipated. The mayor had called, demanding answers about why the department was planning to kill a hero dog. The governor's office had issued a statement asking for a full review of the case. Animal rights organizations were threatening protests, and 3 different television networks had requested interviews with Atlas himself. "The optics are challenging," Chief Bradley admitted, using the bureaucratic euphemism that meant they were facing a public relations nightmare. "The community is rallying around this dog in ways I've never seen before." But the real game changer came in the form of a phone call that Chief Bradley received while Margaret sat in his office. On the other end of the line was Derek Williams, calling from his hospital bed where he was recovering from Atlas's attack and Margaret's gunshots. "Chief Bradley, this is Derek Williams. I heard about the dog, about what you're planning to do to him." Derek's voice was hoarse but clear through the speakerphone. "I want to make a statement. That dog saved my life too." Margaret's blood ran cold. After everything Derek had done, after his attempt to murder Isabella, he was now trying to manipulate the narrative once again. "How do you figure that, Mr. Williams?" Chief Bradley asked, his voice carefully neutral. "I was out of my mind with grief and rage," Derek continued, his words carefully chosen. "I was planning to kill that baby and then turn the gun on myself. I wanted to die anyway. I've wanted to die since my daughter was killed. But when that dog attacked me, when Officer Sullivan shot me, it snapped me out of it. I realized what I was about to do, and it horrified me." Margaret felt sick. Derek was spinning his failed murder attempt into a story of redemption, portraying Atlas as having saved him from committing an even worse crime. "I don't want that dog to die because of my madness," Derek said, his voice taking on what sounded like genuine remorse. "If anything, he should be honored. He stopped me from becoming a child killer, and maybe that gives my daughter's death some meaning. Maybe she sent that dog to stop me from destroying more innocent lives." Chief Bradley ended the call and sat in silence for several minutes, processing what they'd just heard. Margaret felt torn between rage at Derek's manipulation and hope that his statement might save Atlas's life. "There's something else," Chief Bradley said finally. "I've been reviewing the case files from 3 years ago when Atlas was removed from search and rescue duty. The official report said he failed to find Tommy Rodriguez, but there's a sealed addendum that tells a different story." Margaret's heart began to race as Chief Bradley pulled out a thick file folder marked "Confidential, Rodriguez Case." "Atlas did find Tommy Rodriguez," Chief Bradley continued. "He found the boy's body 2 days into the search, but by then it was too late. Tommy had died from exposure on the first night. The decision was made to continue the search for another week to give the family hope, and then to let hunters discover the body in a different location." The revelation hit Margaret like a physical blow. Atlas had been carrying the guilt of a failure that wasn't his fault for 3 years. And the dog had done his job perfectly. But bureaucratic politics had branded him a failure to spare a grieving family the harsh truth. "Why wasn't this revealed at the time?" Margaret asked, her voice tight with anger. "Political considerations," Chief Bradley replied with obvious discomfort. The Rodriguez family was already destroyed by grief. The decision was made that letting them think their son might still be alive for a few more days was more humane than telling them he'd been dead all along. But there was one final revelation that changed everything. Hidden in the sealed files was a photograph that made Margaret's blood run cold, a picture of 6-year-old Tommy Rodriguez taken just weeks before his death. The boy bore a striking resemblance to Derek Williams' daughter Sarah, the same dark hair and bright smile that had driven Derek to target the Rodriguez family in the first place. "Atlas knew," Margaret whispered, the pieces finally falling into place. When he saw Isabella, when he smelled Derek's intentions at the crash site, Atlas knew that history was repeating itself. He wasn't just protecting Isabella. He was protecting the sister of the boy he'd found too late to save. Chief Bradley looked up at Margaret with newfound respect. That dog's been carrying the weight of a failure that wasn't his fault, and yesterday he got his chance at redemption. Margaret picked up her resignation letter from the desk, tearing it in half as she stood to leave. "So, what happens now, Chief?" "Now," Chief Bradley said, reaching for his phone, "I call a press conference. The community wants to know about their hero dog, and I think it's time they heard the whole truth." As Margaret left the office to return to Atlas's bedside, she felt something she hadn't experienced in months: hope. The system that had been ready to destroy her partner was now being forced to confront the truth of his heroism, and for the first time, Margaret believed that justice might actually prevail. 6 months after that fateful day in the East Texas forest, Margaret Sullivan stood in her backyard watching 18-month-old Isabella Rodriguez take her first tentative steps toward Atlas, who lay patiently in the afternoon sunshine with his tail wagging gently against the wooden deck. The German Shepherd's shoulder had healed completely, though he still bore the scar from Derek Williams' bullet like a badge of honor beneath his graying fur. The press conference that Chief Bradley had called became a turning point, not just for Atlas, but for the entire community of Millfield. When the full story emerged, Derek's premeditated attack, Atlas's heroic protection of Isabella, and the shocking revelation about Tommy Rodriguez's case, the public outcry was immediate and overwhelming. Within days, Atlas went from facing euthanization to being honored with the Governor's Medal of Courage, the first police dog in Texas history to receive the state's highest civilian honor. Margaret had retired from active duty, finally able to admit her cancer diagnosis publicly and focus on her treatment without fear of losing her insurance. The chemotherapy had been brutal, but the latest scans showed her tumors shrinking, and Dr. Mitchell was cautiously optimistic about her prognosis. More importantly, Margaret had found a new purpose that gave her life meaning beyond her badge. The Rodriguez family had made an offer that changed everything. They wanted Margaret and Atlas to become part of their extended family. Elena and Miguel had purchased the small farm adjacent to Margaret's property, creating a compound where Isabella could grow up with Atlas as her constant companion, and Margaret could serve as the grandmother figure she'd always longed to be. "She's going to walk right into his arms," Elena observed from the porch swing, her voice filled with the same wonder that marked every milestone in Isabella's recovery. The baby had suffered no lasting physical effects from the crash or the terrifying hours in the forest, but she had developed an extraordinary bond with Atlas that seemed to transcend normal human-animal relationships. Atlas seemed to understand his role as Isabella's guardian with an almost mystical clarity. He never strayed more than a few feet from the toddler when she was playing, positioned himself between her and any potential danger, and had an uncanny ability to sense when she was about to get into trouble. It was as if his failure to save Tommy Rodriguez had been transformed into an unwavering commitment to protect Isabella with his life. "Atlas, stay," Margaret called softly as Isabella wobbled closer to the patient dog. The command was unnecessary. Atlas hadn't moved except to wag his tail more enthusiastically as the little girl approached. When Isabella finally reached him and grabbed onto his fur to steady herself, Atlas remained perfectly still, allowing her to use him as a living support system. The sight brought tears to Margaret's eyes, as it always did. In Isabella's laughing face and Atlas's gentle patience, she could see the healing of old wounds and the creation of new bonds that would last a lifetime. The baby, who had almost died in Derek Williams' twisted quest for revenge, was now thriving, surrounded by love and protected by a dog who had found his true calling. Derek Williams himself had become an unexpected ally in Atlas's redemption story. From his prison cell, where he was serving a 25-year sentence for attempted murder and assault, Derek had written dozens of letters to news outlets, politicians, and animal rights organizations advocating for Atlas and acknowledging the dog's role in preventing him from committing an even worse crime. Whether his remorse was genuine or calculated, his testimony had been instrumental in changing public opinion about Atlas's actions. "I was a broken man who wanted to break others," Derek had written in his most widely published letter. "Atlas stopped me from destroying an innocent life and in doing so saved whatever humanity I had left. That dog is a hero in every sense of the word, and anyone who says otherwise doesn't understand what real courage looks like." The story had resonated far beyond East Texas. Atlas's tale of redemption and heroism had been featured on national television, spawning a best-selling children's book and even a proposed Hollywood movie. But more importantly, it had inspired changes in police K-9 protocols across the country, with new guidelines that took into account the complex decision-making abilities of highly trained dogs in crisis situations. Margaret's phone buzzed with a text message from Father Michael O'Brien, the priest who had become a close friend during her cancer treatment. "Saw Isabella's video on Elena's Facebook. That child is going to be walking marathons before you know it. Atlas must be so proud. See you all at Sunday dinner. Father Mike." The weekly Sunday dinners had become a tradition, bringing together an extended family that included the Rodriguez clan, Margaret, various police officers and their families, Dr. Chen, the veterinarian, and anyone else who had been touched by Atlas's story. These gatherings served multiple purposes. They provided Isabella with a large, loving support system. They gave Margaret the family connections she'd always craved, and they reminded everyone present that miracles could emerge from even the darkest circumstances. "Look at that," Miguel Rodriguez said as he joined the women on the porch, his voice filled with paternal pride as Isabella took 3 unsteady steps toward Atlas before plopping down in the grass next to the dog. "She's not afraid of anything when he's around." Atlas immediately shifted position to curl protectively around Isabella, creating a living fortress that allowed the toddler to explore safely while remaining completely secure. The sight was so natural, so perfectly choreographed, that it was easy to forget how close they had all come to losing everything. Margaret's oncologist had told her that stress and purposelessness were among the biggest factors in cancer progression, while hope and meaningful relationships were powerful allies in the healing process. Watching Isabella and Atlas together, surrounded by the loving chaos of their chosen family, Margaret felt her heart fill with a peace she hadn't experienced since Frank's death. The irony wasn't lost on her that cancer, the disease that had threatened to end her career and her life, had ultimately led her to the most fulfilling chapter of her existence. Without the diagnosis, she never would have hidden her condition, never would have stayed on the force long enough to be at that crash site, and never would have been there when Atlas needed her most. "You know what I think?" Elena said, settling back in the porch swing as Isabella's laughter mixed with Atlas's gentle panting. "I think Atlas knew all along that this was how things were supposed to end up. I think he brought Isabella into that forest not just to protect her from Derek, but to bring all of us together." Margaret nodded, unable to speak past the emotion in her throat. Atlas had indeed brought them all together, A dying cop, a grieving family, a heroic dog seeking redemption, and a baby who needed protection. Their individual tragedies had been transformed into a collective triumph that continued to ripple outward, touching lives far beyond their small East Texas community. As the afternoon sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, Margaret watched Isabella finally succumb to exhaustion and curl up against Atlas's warm fur for a nap. The dog's eyes met Margaret's across the yard, and in that amber gaze she saw contentment, purpose, and something that looked remarkably like gratitude. "Thank you," Margaret whispered to her four-legged partner, though the words seemed inadequate for everything Atlas had given her. He had saved Isabella's life, exposed Derek's evil, brought justice to Tommy Rodriguez's memory, and created a family where none had existed before. Atlas's tail wagged once against the grass as if to say, "Thank you for giving me the chance to be the hero I always knew I could be." In the fading light of that perfect evening, surrounded by love and laughter and the promise of tomorrow, Margaret understood that sometimes the most broken things, hearts, dreams, even people and dogs, could be mended into something stronger and more beautiful than they had ever been before. The good Lord truly did work in mysterious ways, and sometimes those ways had four legs, amber eyes, and the courage to risk everything for love. Dear friends, watching Atlas and little Isabella reminds us that love knows no boundaries, and that sometimes our greatest heroes come in unexpected forms. Their story shows us that even in our darkest moments, when we feel broken or forgotten, we still have the power to protect what matters most. How many of you have experienced that special bond with a loyal companion who saw you through difficult times? What moments in your own life remind you that miracles can emerge from the most challenging circumstances? Please share your stories in the comments below. Your experiences might be exactly what someone else needs to hear today. Discussion questions. Have you ever had a pet or animal companion who seemed to understand your needs better than most people? What's a time in your life when something that seemed like a tragedy actually led to unexpected blessings?